The legend of BottleHill. Many Irish places have their own origins in myth and legend. One such place is BottleHill, which is between Mallow and Blarney in County Cork in the south of Ireland. The story is how BottleHill got its name and how it was originally published in 1906 by Thomas Crofton Croker in Fairy Legends and the Traditions of the South of Ireland. Near Mallow, a poor farmer called Mick Purcell lived with his wife and children. They rented a small farm from the local landlord and lived as simply as they could, only eating what they grew, but no matter how much they scrimped and saved, paying the rent was always a problem. And this actually goes back to a very interesting Irish fact. Irish colonialism and the fact that England came over and started dividing the country and anglicising it meant that the landlords would rent out farmers' lands to the farmers. So English landlords would come in, rent out the own land to the farmers for extortionary rates back then. And this is why the potato was so popular in Ireland. It was one of the cheapest things that could be imported and basically grown, and it had so much nutrients. That's why it's such a big thing, like, in our history. And when it comes to like the Irish potato blight, the fact we couldn't eat the only thing that we could actually afford, that's why so many people emigrated. Fun little bit of history as we start off this story. One year, after a bad harvest, their chickens died of disease and their pig got measles, and Mick didn't have enough money to pay the landlord for the rent. "What are we going to do, Molly?" he asked his wife. "There's only one thing to do," she replied. "We'll have to go and sell the cow at the fair in Cork. If this turns into the Irish version of Jack and the Beanstalk, I'm going to be throwing shapes at people." Reluctantly, Mick agreed, and he set out the next day with the cow. After a long and tiring walk, he came to the top of a steep hill and he met a tiny man. I swear, if this man gives him beans. No bigger than a small child. The man had white hair and reddish eyes and a very sharp nose and pointed ears. Nick said hello politely, but kept on walking briskly because he feared that the stranger was one of the fairy folk or fae. And Mick knew better than to get involved with them. The little man, however, followed Mick, and soon they were walking side by side, though walking was probably the wrong word for what the little man was doing. It was almost like he was floating. His feet weren't even touching the ground. "Where are you going with that cow?" asked the stranger. "I'm going to sell her at the fair in Cork." "Will you sell her to me instead?" Mick didn't want to have any dealings with the little people, but to refuse one was just as dangerous. How much would you give me for her?" The old fairy pulled out a glass bottle and said, "I'll give you this." I am so happy it wasn't a bag of beans, guys. I am so happy. "An empty bottle? What good is an empty bottle to me? My wife would kill me if I came home with an empty glass bottle. A bottle won't feed my family or pay the rent." "This bottle is worth more than any amount of money you'll get at the fair." I think I'll take my chances at the fair," said Mick. "Take your chances all you want. But how do you know you'll get a good price at the fair? How do you know that cow won't die before you reach Cork?" the man said with a nasty grin. Was the fairy threatening Mick? "Make up your mind, Mick Purcell," said the little fellow. How does he know my name?" thought Mick. As if reading his mind, the fairy said, "I know all about you, Mick Purcell. Now what will it be?" Out of fear, Mick handed the cow over to the little fairy. "When you get home, put the bottle on the table and say the words, 'Bottle, do my duty,' and you will get what you deserve." Is this Irish Aladdin? This is Irish Aladdin, guys. I'm sorry, I got mixed up with Jack and the Beanstalk. We got an Aladdin genie here. Mick thanked the man and began to retrace his steps home. When he glanced behind him, he saw the little man and the cow had completely vanished. Mick knew for sure that he had just done a deal with one of the seed, the fairy kind of Ireland. He hurried home and surprised his wife, who was sweeping the floor. "Mick, have you been to Cork already. I sold the cow to a man on the road. Oh, how much did you get for her? I got this, Mick said, and he pulled the bottle out of his pocket. An empty bottle. You sold our cow for an empty bottle, you some sort of fool, Mick Purcell. She clattered across his head with the back of the broom. When she calmed down, eventually, Mick told her the whole story. The bottle is magic, you see. Said the wife. Let's see. So Mick placed the bottle in the middle of the table and said, Bottle, do your duty. Mick and Molly's children gasped as a twinkling light swirled around inside the bottle, and from the neck and it emerged a little man's... It's a genie. It's a genie. It's a genie in a bottle. It's a genie in a... Irish Aladdin, lads. This is Irish Aladdin. A little man's head emerged. Molly stepped back from the table in terror as the little man lifted himself out of the bottle and reached to pull a companion out of identical size and appearance. These two little sprites began pulling tiny golden plates and dishes out of the bottle, and they grew to full size when they were placed on the table. Then, the men pulled out silver knives and forks and spoons, and then they produced the most marvelous assortment of food. Roast ham, boiled ham, honeyed vegetables, creamy mashed potatoes, apple tart. Oh, when the table was covered in food and the air smelt of sweet, delicious smells, the two tiny men popped and disappeared back into the bottle. I told you, the bottle was magic, said Mick, dancing around the room. That night, the family dined like royalty, licking every crumb off the golden plates. With the children in bed now, Molly said, Indeed, your bottle is magic, Mick. I'm sorry for hitting you with my broom. But we can't exactly pay the landlord with roast beef and potatoes now, can we? Mick picked up the golden plates. I bet we could fetch a pretty penny for these. The next day, Mick took the plates to Cork and made sure to go a different route as to avoid the hill he met the fairy on. The plate turned out to be pure gold, and Mick sold it for more money than he had ever had in his life, and he was able to buy a new house and cart and still have enough money left over to pay the landlord. After that, the Purcells were always with money to pay the rent. When they ran out of it, they simply sold another plate. When the plates ran out, they just counted and commanded and asked the bottle to do some more magic. And indeed, they got so rich, they splashed out on cattle and jewellery and fancy clothes. But after a while, their landlord started to get suspicious. None of his other tenants were prospering this well with their tiny little farms. He called around to ask Mick where he was getting the money from. Whether it was due to honesty or boastfulness, no one knows. But Mick told the landlord about his magic bottle. And the greedy landlord offered Mick a great deal of money for the bottle, but Mick declined. Why would I sell you my bottle for money, when it itself is a money-making machine? Then sell it for something that money can't buy, said the landlord. What do you mean? I'll give you your farm in exchange for the bottle. You'll never have to pay rent again. Mick was so excited about the thought of never paying rent again that he accepted the offer without even thinking about it. After that, things didn't go so well for the Purcells. Sure, they now owned their own farm, but the magic bottle was gone. They soon let the farm go to rack and ruin because they were so lazy, and it got to the stage that they didn't have enough food to feed the children again. Mick, said Molly, take our last cow to the hill and see if the little man will give you another magic bottle. Mick did as she was told and returned to the hill. Sure enough, the little man with the red eyes and pointed ears was there. Well, Mick Purcell, how can I help you today? I was wondering if you'd like to take my cow in exchange for another magic bottle? Well, it just so happens that I have another bottle, said the fairy, pulling out of his jacket a little bottle and handing it to Mick. You know what to do with it. Nick nodded and returned home with the bottle, placing it in front of his wife, and said, Bottle, do your duty! As before, a light twinkled in the bottle, and the little man lifted himself out before reaching to pull out his companion, but instead of producing gold plates, they hopped down off the table and began racing around the kitchen, smashing all of Molly's crockery and pulling the curtains off the windows, and Mick chased them, but they giggled with glee and they slipped out of his grasp, knocking over the churn of milk, smashing the last of the eggs. One of them threw a sod of turf out the window, while the other pulled a burning stick from the hearth and put it on the cushions. The children ran screaming out of the house while Mick and Molly stamped out the flames of the cushions, and the two little sprites squealed with delight, broke an oil lamp, and turned over the furniture and ripped the feathers. Indeed, they didn't return to the bottle until the whole house was trashed. Molly glanced around her kitchen, which looked like, well, an angry bull had visited. In despair, she lay on the ground and cried, and Mick looked at the empty bottle on the table and remembered the old fairy's promise. "You'll get what you deserve, Mick." I got what I deserved, all right, he thought. This was my own fault. I had a perfectly good bottle that gave me more money than I ever needed, but I got greedy. Determined to make things right, he took the bottle to his old landlord, who happened to be throwing a party when Mick arrived. "Mick Purcell, what can I do for you?" "Oh, it's just, what can you do for me? But what I can do for you, actually," said Mick. "I brought you another bottle." "Is it magic as well, Mick?" Mick nodded. Come in," leading Mick into the great hall with all the wealthy guests. The landlord smiled and beamed, and Mick saw his old bottle up on a shelf. "Show us what it can do." Mick took the bottle out of his jacket pocket, placed it on the floor, and said, "Bottle, do your duty." Out emerged the two little sprites, giggling a high-pitched, evil laughter. The landlord and the guests smiled in amazement, but only Mick knew what was about to happen. And sure enough, the two little fairies began speeding around the room, smashing crystal glasses, the fine china. Everyone screamed as glass rained upon them. They tried to catch the little creatures, but they were too flighty in human hands, and the sprites turned over bookcases, pulled down the chandelier, poked holes in the paintings. "Oh, make them stop," shouted the landlord. "Only if you give me my old bottle back," said Mick. "Ah, take it, boy." Mick waited until the two little fairies had finished destroying the whole house, returned to the bottle, and then he took both bottles home with him. After that, Mick and Molly became very wealthy again, but the Purcell children married into prosperous families and became rich too. And indeed, one of their sons married the landlord's daughter, and the landlord spent such a fortune restoring his wrecked hall that he was too scared to mention the bottles ever again. Mick and Molly learned to work hard, even with their luck, and they lived to a ripe old age, and both died on the same day. At their wake, a fight broke out amongst all the servants about who would get the magic bottles, and they broke, accidentally. The little fairies were never seen again, but from that day on, that hill became known as BottleHill.